Hello, good morning for our colleagues in Americas, and good afternoon, late afternoon for those of you who are joining from Europe. My name is Jovan Kurbalija, and I'm particularly honored to be today at this session on international digital standards, setting up the environment of stakeholders for the ARIN region. As you know, ARIN stands for American Registry for Internet Numbers. For those of you who are new to the internet lingo, they are basically coordinating distribution of the internet numbers, and they are one of the regional registries covering North America and Caribbean region. And we at Diplo, we are particularly honored to benefit from the ARIN's regional country project community grant, which was aimed to see, as you will witness in a few minutes, what is the participation in particular of the small and developing island states in the standardization process. This discussion is very timely. Just a few hours ago, we had our monthly briefing and a very interesting discussion of the rising importance of standardization for digital policy and absence of small and developing countries. It is exact timing, just a few hours later, we are discussing these issues, and we are discussing this ahead of a major IQ gathering, which will discuss the question of the standardization. It's the forum, standardization forum, which will be held in early March in Geneva. I'm particularly honored to have today with us two speakers. First, Einar Bochlin, Vice President for Government Affairs of American Registry for Internet Numbers. Welcome, Einar. And he will address us in a few minutes on the behalf of ARIN community. And we have today with us the author of the study, Sorina Teleanu. Sorina, as you know, is a senior researcher at Diplo and person who already conducted a few studies, important studies on standardization, including the study on China and standardization. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Einar to join us. You can use the chat facility for asking questions and comments, which we will address after initial presentation by Einar and Sorina. Einar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jovan. Pleasure to be here today. Nice to meet you, Sorina, and good to see all attendees. Wish I could see you in person, of course, but we're living in a mostly virtual world still. And when we talk about standards, I'm sure I'm not the first person to do this, but I'm going to use this Zoom session as an example of the importance of standards. Just talk about some of the different standards that go into producing this event that we're doing. I mean, you've got hardware standards, standards for the microphone, the camera in our devices. You've got standards for the production of the electricity that powers these devices. And of course, you've got internet standards for sending the data back and forth that makes this work. You've got standards for video and audio compression that are being used to make my voice and my picture come across physical mediums, which also have standards. All these different things are necessary to make this event work. And without them, we wouldn't have this session. So that's just a little piece about standards. Like Jovan said, ARIN is one of the 5 RIRs, and our service region is Canada, the US, and a couple dozen islands and countries in the Caribbean. And we have a meeting coming up in April. We have 2 meetings a year. I'd like to mention that we have a fellowship program in case there's someone here from the ARIN region and would like to get more information and participate at the ARIN meeting. I invite you to see the ARIN website and look for information about fellowships. All the other RERs also have fellowship programs. So based on where you're located, if you're interested in number resources, IPv4, IPv6, autonomous system numbers, and if you're interested in how the RERs function, please see information about those fellowship programs. I'd also like to talk about the grant program. The ARIN grant program is opening again in late March and will be open for applications through June. The grant program at a high level is to fund programs like this, which produced a research paper. They're technical to support and improve the internet. They're non-commercial, and that's open, if I'm not mistaken, to greater than our region. And essentially, we're here today to hear about this paper that was produced as a result of the grant program, and ARIN is proud and honored to have funded this, and we look forward to it and look forward to discussion about it. Thank you, Jovan.
Thank you very much for giving us the context for this research, and also calls for people from the region to apply for your various programs. And I have to indicate that one important part of ARIN activity is exactly that involvement of a small and developing island states who are often missing actor in the global digital policy due to their limited human, financial, institutional resources. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Sorina's presentation. Sorina, could you guide us through the summary of your presentation? We'll be sharing the links that you can download the texts in English and Spanish, and we will take it from there. Sorina, over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. Hello, everyone. Kindly asking my colleagues if they could share the slides as we go through. Thank you, that was fast. As it was said, we just published the paper today, and my colleagues will be sharing the links in chat, both in English and in Spanish, kindly inviting everyone to take a look. But before you go through the 25 or 30 pages of that paper, I'll guide you quickly through some of the issues we've covered in the document. And as it was said already, it is about international digital standards, a term we use for standards for digital technologies developed at the international level. And we look a bit at how stakeholders from countries in the ARIN region participate in some of the key SDOs, and then we make some recommendations for a more active engagement in those SDOs. If we can move on, please. We can skip that, I've just mentioned the content. Speaking about digital standards, there are so many definitions given by various organizations. I just picked one to show on the next slide, please, just to have a starting point. This is how the International Organization for Standardization and the Electrotechnical Commission define a standard as a document established by consensus, which is a key word for the development of standards, and approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use, rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities or their results aimed at achieving an optimum degree or order in a given context. And this order can also be how we're using this Zoom today, as Einar was just mentioning. Moving on, we focus, as I've said, on digital standards and standards for digital technologies. And here are just a few examples. We can talk about technical internet standards, the TCP/IP or DNSSEC, web standards, standards for network and infrastructure, and there is this huge debate about 5G and the future 6G standardization. And of course, a lot of discussions around setting standards for new or advanced technologies or emerging or whatever term we might want to use for this. And here we include everything from artificial intelligence to robotics, quantum computing, biotechnology, and everything at the intersection of digital technologies with other technological areas. Moving on. A few notes on types of standards or classifications, just two of them. Most standards are voluntary, meaning that companies decide based on their goals and interests whether they adopt or implement certain standards or not. But there are also cases when standards can be made mandatory. Jovan mentioned the study on China we published last year. In China, there is a type of mandatory standards which are developed as mandatory from the beginning. There are also cases in the US or European Union or Canada where standards can be made mandatory through laws or regulations, so their implementation becomes compulsory. And then we also have a distinction between de facto and de jure standards. De facto ones basically emerge through market uptake, and de jure are developed by established standardization organization. The acronym SDO stands for Standard Development Organization. What's interesting here is that most of the time de facto standards become de jure as they are adopted by SDOs. And one example is the PDF. It was initially developed as a file format by Adobe, and then it made it to a standard adopted by the ITUT, or at ITUT to be more correct. Moving on. International digital standards, we can move on. Before we discuss a bit about where international standards are developed, it's important to also explain that there are standards being developed at national level as well, and there are standard development organizations nationally. They normally involve stakeholders from different categories, be they companies, governmental entities, sometimes civil society organizations, and academia. And here are a few examples. In the US, ANSI, the Standards Council in Canada, and all ARIN countries have their own standardization organization. Then we have regional SDOs, and in the ARIN region, or better said, some of the countries from the ARIN region participate in two regional SDOs there. One is CROSC, which is the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, and the other is COPANT, which is the Pan American Standards Commission. I think 9 of the ARIN countries are members of both organizations, but more details in the paper. And then we have the international SDOs, and here are just a few examples. We have the so-called formal SDOs, ISO, IEC already mentioned, and standardization arm of the ITUT. We have W3C, IETF, Standards for the Internet, IEEE Standard Organization, which is working on quite a wide range of standards for the advanced technologies I was mentioning earlier, and 3GPP focusing these days mostly on 5G related standardization. And besides these formal SDOs, there are also many industry forums and consortia also focused on the development of standards, because basically sometimes the industry finds it faster and, let's say, more efficient to develop standards among themselves and not go through the complex procedures of international SDOs. And sometimes you would have a consortium formed only for the development of one standard, and once that standard is developed, then the organization just stops to exist or work. Moving on. A few notes on the landscape of setting international standards, and these are just two characteristics we go a bit into in the paper, one being complexity and the other one dynamism. On the complexity, I've already mentioned there are many organizations involved in the development of standards at the international level. They have different membership structures, different working methods, and this is one of the elements that makes the ecosystem a bit complex. You do need to understand how everything works if you want to participate in more than one. And this also creates the space for overlaps in work, because there is no such thing as a general agreement saying this organization is dealing with this kind of standards and the other with other kind of standards, and no one is stepping into each other's territory. These things happen. And this also allows for the so-called forum shopping. So you would see stakeholders going from organization to organization with a specific standard proposal, trying to find the environment where it's easier for them to get the standard approved. And these are challenges that have been around forever, since the standardization organizations have started working on this, although they have become a bit more visible in the media recently in the context of some countries becoming more involved. SDOs are trying to address at least some of these challenges, and one of the ways they do this is through fostering cooperation. For instance, you would have the World Standards Cooperation, where the 3 key SDOs try to get together and avoid, to the extent possible, overlaps in work, and that's between IEC, ISO, and ITUT. There are also liaisons between some of the SDOs and joint technical groups. And one example is the joint technical group 1 between ISO and IEC dealing with information technology issues. And the second key characteristic is dynamism. And this, on the one hand, relates to the fact that there are always new technologies that are being standardized, and the SDOs are trying to keep up with this technological progress, while at the same time trying to maintain the integrity of the work, which again is challenging, balancing the two. And you might have heard quite a lot of calls for SDOs to become more efficient, to speed up the development of a standard. There's always this balance that needs to be achieved with maintaining the integrity and respecting the rules. And again, going back to the consensus I've mentioned earlier, that's a key element in developing standards in the key SDOs. And then we have these shifts in participation of various actors in some of the key standard development organizations. And this is reflecting, on the one hand, the changing competition landscape. Some actors who are new are also becoming involved into standardization processes, like the app developer companies, which have not been around 10, 20 years ago. And we also have a growing involvement of some actors from certain countries which have not been so much involved in the 1990s or even before, for example. And China would be here the classical example, together with Japan and South Korea as well. Moving on. Now getting to the core element of this paper, which is the participation of stakeholders in ARIN countries in key SDOs. Moving on. We looked at the organizations I mentioned on one of the previous slides, and that's ISO, IEC, ITUT, and then a bit also at W3C, IETF, and 3GPP. And what we found, it's not surprising, I think. There is quite a lot of participation from stakeholders from Canada and the USA, but not so much participation from the smaller countries in the region. And on this slide, you're just seeing an example from ISO. We looked at how these countries, well, their national SDOs participate in technical committees and subcommittees at the ISO. And you see the big difference between Canada, USA on the one hand, and the other 8 countries active in this organization. Some of them are just subscriber member or correspondent member. It doesn't mean they cannot participate. They can participate in standard development processes, but they are not extremely active, as you can see by the number of technical committees they are part of, either as full member or serving member. Moving on, we looked at ITU and ITUT, and here I think I do have to mention that participation in ISO, IEC on the one hand, and ITU on the other hand is a bit different. At the ISO and IEC, you have national SDOs who can be members, and only that. Of course, other stakeholders can participate through the national SDOs. At the ITUT, the membership or ability to participate is a bit wider, and you would have governmental entities, private companies, and a bunch of other organizations being able to join as sector members more often. And what we see on this chart is a comparison of the number of members, total ITU members, and also members of ITUT, which is the standardization arm of ITU. And here again, it's more or less as in the case of the ISO, we have quite some participation from Canada and USA in terms of numbers of members. But the only other country which has ITUT members is Jamaica. Everyone else is only represented at the ITU through either their ministries with responsibilities for electronic communications or telecom, or the national regulators. To what extent these also participate in standardization work is not something we were able to dig into, but let's hope they do attend at least some of the study group meetings. Moving on. We have added in the report a few more statistical information about how Canada and the USA, as the more active countries, do participate in these STOs, but I'll skip this part just to mention that for the other organizations we looked at, which are IEC, IETF, W3C, and 3GPP, only Canada and the USA are represented, and they are among the most active actors. Maybe with a bit of a difference at the ITUT, but I won't spoil your reading of the paper, kindly encouraging you to look through those numbers there. Moving on. So we saw where we are and where we stand with the participation of stakeholders from ARIN countries in those key STOs. What we're trying to say is that there is a need for a more active engagement and more awareness raising. And we're trying to explain why, as we said at the beginning, building on the fact that standards are not only a technical issue. Next slide, please. So we look at the implications of standards. We have small sections on this in the paper, also giving examples of specific standards and how they have these kind of implications, and also what does that mean for different stakeholders. So how standards are relevant for governments, for private companies, for the tech community, civil society, and others. Technical implications, I think these are obvious for everyone. We speak about facilitating interoperability, fostering quality of service and quality of experience, safety and security, if we talk about security standards, and other related issues. Moving on, there are also economic implications of standards. They support innovation, help develop and sustain competitiveness among the companies that adopt a certain, in particular, international standard. And here also comes their role in facilitating global trade. And we talk a bit in the paper about the relevance of some standards, in particular those developed by ISO, IEC, and ITUT, in the World Trade Organization context, more specifically the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. Just in short, these standards are basically recognized as not posing technical barriers to trade, which means governments are strongly encouraged to use them when they develop their technical regulations at a national level. And this also explains a bit why more and more countries, actors are interested in participating specifically in these three organizations. Moving on, we also have discussions about the potential roles of standards in driving sustainable development. And there was an event last year organized on this by the three STOs together with G20. And there was an interesting outcome at the end of that event, basically saying that international digital standards can help societies take advantage of the opportunities offered by digital technologies and address some of the pressing challenges. Moving on, we also have the human rights dimension, and here we basically have the idea that standards can provide the context for promoting or abusing human rights. And we've had the discussions around the new IP proposal last year. I don't think I have to mention it, probably everyone is aware about this, but more recently, there is, for instance, attention being paid to standards developed for facial recognition technologies or biometrics, and how those might be impacting in some way or another the abuse or respect of human rights. And the fact that there are human rights dimensions of standards and standardization processes calls for integrating a human rights approach to these processes, and also fostering more links between standards and human rights communities. And it was last year that the Human Rights Council actually adopted a resolution calling for consultations among the various international communities on the relations between standards, technical standards, and human rights. And that's, I would say, a good development. Let's see what happens and what comes out of those consultations. Moving on. There is also a possibility that standards can help achieve certain public policy objectives, from improving public services to advancing innovation and economic growth that we've already mentioned, protecting consumers and ensuring safe development of technologies. And then we move to the geopolitical implications of standards. Next slide, please. More recently, standards have come up on the agenda of various geopolitical fora, let's call them like that, although standards have always had a political and geopolitical dimension. Now they're seen more in the context of the tech competition between nations, so you would see quite a lot of calls for the so-called like-minded partners to cooperate on the development of certain standards, or on how certain standards might be promoting or advancing some values over the other. And just a few examples on this slide, and also with a bit more details in the paper. We have at G7 a framework for collaboration on digital technical standards. Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and USA look at digital standards in the context of this new critical and emerging technology working group. And there is the famous EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which has a dedicated working group on digital standards. Again, with the goal of fostering more cooperation between countries and their stakeholders, especially when they all participate in international standardization. The so-called standardization blocks among some countries to oppose proposals coming from other countries or other stakeholders. Again, something that has been around since standards started being developed at the international level. Moving on. And the last part of our paper is listing a few recommendations on what could be done to step up the engagement of stakeholders from developing countries, in this case, particularly from the ARIN region, but could also apply for other developing countries. And the first batch of recommendations is, if we can move to the next slide. For the regional STOs, the two I've mentioned earlier, related to intensifying capacity development initiatives, on the one hand, to raise more awareness about standards, and on the other hand, to build the capacities of regional stakeholders to participate in international standardization processes. And these initiatives could be run, for instance, in cooperation with the international STOs, and at least one of the two regional STOs have cooperation agreements, at least with IEC and ISO. Other recommendations relate to strengthening relations with international STOs, trying to maybe coordinate positions among STOs from the region and then trying to represent them in the international STOs. And of course, encouraging the application of international standards nationally, which already happens in the case of the two regional STOs. Moving on, we have recommendations for national governments and national STOs in the ARIN countries. And these relate to developing, for instance, national standardization strategies with priorities and goals related to both setting of national standards and participation in international standard setting. And here, one recommendation, to the extent possible, is to try to align these standardization strategies with other plans, strategies, policies the countries might be having on economic and industrial issues. Again, to the extent possible, try to allocate more resources when it comes to participating in international STOs. And because many of the key STOs we've covered are based in Geneva, we also have a recommendation about making use of the fact that these countries have missions in Geneva to try to engage at least the governmental stakeholders in the work of the Geneva-based STOs following this work, and maybe trying to create some cooperation frameworks in which they could keep each other alert about what's happening there. And the same goes for participation in ITU, building on the participation of ministries and NRIs as members of the ITU. And then the last set of recommendations related to engaging other stakeholders in international activities. As we've said, it's not only national STOs that have a chance to participate, they can engage other actors as well, and joining forces to increase presence in international STOs, because there are so many organizations and so many processes within them. It's really basically impossible for any one actor to follow everything, and that's the case also for developed countries. So cooperation here is welcome. And the last set of recommendations, if we can move on, is for international STOs themselves to partner with national and regional STOs to use them as an avenue for raising more awareness about international standard setting, to support the inclusion of actors less represented. And here again, we have the famous standardization gap everyone is aware of. And most of the STOs have programs and initiatives targeted as attracting more participation from small and developing countries. And for the Geneva-based STOs, recommendation to actively reach out to Geneva missions and try to offer support for actors there when it comes to engagement in standardization processes. And we end here. The recommendations in the paper go a bit in more detail. So just a kind encouragement again to everyone to take a look there. And I'll stop here and happy to take questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorina, for quite a comprehensive survey of activities of a standardization organization and participation of small island states. What has been, I've been following carefully Sorina's really comprehensive research, and the one question which has been echoing in this research is that standardization process is very demanding in terms of people, time. It is, in a way, it is a marathon, and you need a lot of resources to that marathon. And it's a real question how, on one side, small island states and developing states cannot afford not to participate, because Sorina mentioned quite a few implications, and on the other side, they face limited resources. Therefore, it is a bit of a catch-22, development catch-22 element. Sorina, you mentioned that most of standardization development organizations have some programs, but what we notice is also that they are hitting the limit of the institutional and individual capacity, simply the size. Therefore, there could be some sort of new development, new dynamics, probably with ARIN or some other regional, CARICOM or other actors in the region that could help joining forces via missions here and making that burden more, let's say, easier to carry. Do you have any point on that? And then we will also now turn to Einar for his comments and questions before we ask others to join us in this discussion. Sorina.
Thanks, Jovan. I don't think we have a universal solution to address the challenge of stakeholders from developing countries participating in international standardization or following the work. As I've said, it's challenging for any one country or any one stakeholder to follow everything that's happening. But a few things that can be done on the one hand would be to basically join forces, create partnerships with others who follow standardization work, and then create, maybe an alert system where you would inform the others about what you've been following and things they might want to pay attention to. And this applies not only to countries or governmental stakeholders, but also trying to get civil society organizations on board, because we keep talking about the human rights implications of technologies and standards. They at least would be focused on this very specific issue of human rights, and they would be able to alert others when, human rights related issues come up. But yeah, I guess my one solution recommendation, I don't know how to call it, would be to try to foster more partnerships. But in this idea of keeping everyone informed, and maybe not so much on, trying to act against some proposals because they come from certain actors. Every proposal should be discussed on its own merits and not so much on where it comes from. But I won't go more into that. Thanks, Jovan.
But Sorina, you mentioned, and that's the Richard commented that mainly companies who have the most direct interest around standards because of their profit and the bottom line, they are really present. But this idea of alert system, which could be very sophisticated, maybe AI-based system, which will say, okay, here is the country, Santa Lucia or other small countries. If they have specific interest, let's say in developing standards for the emergency situations due to hurricanes in the recent years, that could be an interesting idea to have them focused on the issues that are of most direct concern and probably have occasional briefings about overall trends. But I guess that would be the major challenge to address in coming years. Einar, any comment from your side? They face also small states challenge to follow the internet community actors, which ICANN has thousands of meetings. Have you found any solution, and what could be learned from the internet community for dealing with standardization challenges?
Thank you for that question. We have colleagues at the other RERs, the internet community, ICANN, ISOC, IETF, the RERs. It's important over time to build relationships, of course, with colleagues and develop those chains of communication so that we can keep each other informed about developments, because yeah, it's pretty hard to follow everything. I mean, it's hard to follow any given study group in person at the ITU when there's maybe 4 or 5 different subgroups meeting at the same time. I've been to meetings where we're on WhatsApp or Skype, and we're trying to inform each other about what's happening in quite small rooms in real time. So some sort of system, any kind of system that would help check and alert us about events would be welcome. I did have a question about the presentation on the ITUT slide, specifically regarding membership. With the item, I'll just pick out Jamaica. With the item on Jamaica that showed several T sector members and I think 1 D sector member, did I understand correctly that those are all Jamaican government organizations, that it's only Canada and the US that have companies, private sector members? Question for Serena, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Einar, for this general comment, how to follow, which I think we'll need to put quite a bit of creative and intellectual power to see how to do it. But maybe building on what you just described, that people ping each other on WhatsApp and say, hey, by the way, next door we have this discussion that could be of relevance for you. Sorina, the question for you.
Yes, Jamaica. No, it's not. Well, in that particular case, it's not only governmental entities. I look quickly through my notes. Digicel Group is the one technical company that participates in ITUT as a non-governmental entities. But for everyone else, except for Canada and the USA, it is indeed governmental entities who are part of the ITU, and we can assume they also might want to follow some of the standardization work. I hope that helps.
Thank you for that answer. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. Let us make just a quick excursion to another organization where small states face challenge to participate. Marilia is following closely economic diplomacy and discussion in WTO, including participation or partial participation of the small island states. Marilia, what would be your reflection, and can we learn something from the, let's say, trade, e-commerce and other processes in order to improve participation in standardization bodies? Marilia Maciel, head of e-commerce at Diplo. No. Okay.
Hello.
trying to unmute. Yes, you are unmuted. Marilia, go ahead.
Thank you, Jovan. I joined as a participant. That's why I didn't have the speaking rights. But thank you. I think that there are some lessons that we can learn. First of all, the digital part of the agenda of the WTO, be it e-commerce discussions or the TBT, is a challenge for everyone. And we see that developed countries, they are trying to find solution on issues that are very cross-cutting and challenging, such as data flows. It's one of the big issues in the e-commerce negotiations right now. But not only that, access to the source code, algorithms, which is somehow related to this discussion because AI will rely heavily on standards as well. This is an issue that countries are still discussing. On the one hand, we have requests for transparency of algorithms to ensure that we don't have bias, for instance. On the other hand, algorithms are protected many times by trade secrets. So I think that it is a challenge for everyone, for developed countries. For developing countries, the challenge is even greater because usually they rely on very small teams, small missions that need to cover a wide range of organizations in Geneva that deal with economic issues. And the WTO itself, as we can see, it's a world in itself because issues that are relevant to this discussion are being discussed inside e-commerce negotiations, also in the technical barriers to trade committee. Therefore, they are really overstretched. I think that these interlinkages are something that we really need to work with, because sometimes different teams are assigned to different committees and we fail to see the big picture. We fail to see the tree. Therefore, I am not sure that diplomats that are negotiating access to the source code of computer programs, for instance, they are following as well the discussions on standardization that happen inside the technical barriers to trade committee. It would be really important to synchronize that and to bear in mind that many of the standards that we are discussing, after all, they are conventions and different from standards on sanitary and phytosanitary measures in the WTO that are based on a recognized science. And the case of the TBT, it's not that. They are widely accepted standards, but that are based on a wide range of issues such as perceptions of national security, cultural sensitivities. Therefore, the scope is much larger. But if you have the support of a TBT for a particular standard, as Serena explained, that has very important repercussions. Therefore, I think that we need to support different countries, especially developing countries, and to build these bridges between different discussions is really important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marilia, for this parallel to the economic trade and WTO negotiation, which are also quite controversial. We have now some question from Pavlina, which I cannot find to Sorina, but Sorina, I guess you get the question, and I'll go through other questions in the chat. As Ginger indicated, I will be reading the questions and then passing to Sorina and to our overall discussion.
Thanks, Jovan. Yes, so Pavlina's question, with the upcoming elections in ITUT, what is the representation of candidates from small and developing countries within the specific working groups? So yes, for a bit of context, we have the WTSA happening next week, and within the framework of this event, there are elections for chairs and vice chairs of the 11 study groups and 2 other groups which are involved in the broader coordination of standardization work at the ITUT. And I've looked a bit at the poll of candidates to see which countries they come from and to what extent this might be bringing any difference to the distribution of chairs and vice chair positions between stakeholders and countries in the current study period. I would say it's more or less from the same countries as there are now, and here you would have quite a wide variety. Developed countries, as we've said, Canada, Germany, Japan, USA, and a few others, but also quite a lot of developing countries who already hold, well, not the countries, stakeholders of the countries to be more accurate, who hold positions within these study groups, and they are again nominating candidates. And just to give a few examples, Tanzania, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Mexico, Sudan, Senegal, and Rwanda. These are some of the countries whose stakeholders already have these leadership positions and who are applying again for the upcoming elections. But we also have candidates from, let's say, newer countries who do not hold these kind of positions yet. And here, as I've said on the event earlier, I think the most interesting case is India, who has put forward 13 proposals for chair and vice chairs, which is equal to the number of candidates from China. And it is interesting because at the moment, India doesn't have any stakeholder in these leadership positions, again, within the 11 study groups and the 2 other more coordination groups. But there is no candidate from the countries we're looking at in this paper beyond Canada and the USA. Pavlina, I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Serena. Let me get back to chat, and Einar, just let us know if you would like to intervene. There was a question from YouTube that there is a concern that the approach is top-down, depriving the individual of say and power. And then Richard Hill answered to this YouTube anonymous question for YouTube. The idea is that market is competitive, so end user exercise. Therefore, the concern from YouTube was that there is too much top-down power. Then Richard answered that there is end users exercising market power and reward products based on good standards. This actually works most of the time. There are a lot of examples. That would be interesting, Richard, definitely to explore these examples. But if I can just reflect on this point, standardization process is not necessarily top-down. You are even there are criticisms of the international organization, but ITU is even quite open. ISO, International Electrotechnical Commission. The problem is not in the formal possibility to participate. There are some formal requirements, but problem is in the effective participation. The door is open in many organizations, but you cannot walk through the door if you cannot walk, if you don't have a power, institutional capacity, individual. And I think this is extremely important to address generally in internet governance. Difference between possibility to contribute and reality, which is very often quite different. Then we have a question big regards to Mavende Nirani from Kenya, who also participate in ITU activities and attempt of ITU to involve more participants from Africa. And she said, participation of private companies from small island states and developing countries is limited as they are represented from headquarters located in developed country. That's an also interesting aspect. It would be great on some other occasions to hear more, or even today, Mavende, on your experience from participating in the ITU activities. Then we have a sort of a YouTube. Can you please transmit Richard's comment to the YouTube audience? This was done. Vlada, small states and big one have an underused mechanism to gather various national stakeholders together. It is only the public institution that should represent a state in various organizations, including the standardization ones. There are many very active state professionals from business, tech community, NGOs that are active in standardization, IGF, ICANN, but that are their voice is heard. States often underuse this extended representation, and as Vlada framed, this is especially important for small states with limited representative capacities. In a nutshell, sit down and make a list of your nationals active in various fora that you don't manage to follow, then get them together and make a national plan with them and work with them. This is, I call it functional multi-stakeholderism, where you basically tap into your resources that you have with your nationals, as Vlada said, at universities, other places. And okay, Marilia, then Mavende, okay, and others, the point about small and otherwise vulnerable groups are very important comment from Ginger and should always be included with a priority. And then this group includes states, organizations, and other groups, including those with disabilities, language difficulties, and even the technically challenged and remote who find it difficult to make their voices heard. ARIN has an excellent track record with this. I know that Ginger is very active in disability community, and standards come here as important tool. Standards for access, for the voice transmission, for transcripts, and that's important part for future research. Marilia, to everyone, standardization is also not top-down at the national level. Many times, standardization organization put a stamp in a long process that happened within, but also at and outside them. Therefore, that's an interesting point. That's the final decision is more sort of codification, what's going on. Very intensive discussion. Richard, Jovan makes a key point. Thank you, Richard. The real barrier to effective participation include money to fund the time required to participate, English language skills, because most of technical work is in English, and technical knowledge, because otherwise you won't be able to influence the work. Therefore, this bit of trinity of challenges. And then we have another continuation. Marilia, yes, it is formally not top-down put, as Johan pointed out. In practice, the work in a particular area tends to be dominated by small group of concerned companies. Ginger, thank you for emphasizing the importance of the vulnerable group. Marilia, Richard, I would add to your excellent summary of the right credentials. Some proposals will be discredited just it comes from certain actors, and that's really rich discussion. We agreed, unlike in the previous session where there were more heated debates. But let me just turn back to our two panelists for their concluding remarks, to Einar and then to Sorina. Einar, what do you get from this discussion, and any point or reflections from your side?
Thank you, Jovan. It's a shame we only had an hour. So going forward with this, I see this as a start to some really good discussions. We have a director of Caribbean Affairs, and I plan to hopefully make use of this paper, perhaps at CTEL or at the CTU, and show people, hopefully from governments in those regions, what the state of participation is. The thing is, I would expect them to ask us what the short and long-term benefits of and more engagement would be. And for that purpose, it might be good to have an example. I would love to talk to, I don't mean to pick on Jamaica again, but I would love to talk to Jamaica and get them to hopefully tell us an example of where participation benefited Jamaica in some way. Perhaps it is in the disaster relief and recovery area, because I know that that is a really big issue for that region. So hopefully something has progressed at an SDO for disaster relief and recovery. I think that's it. I want to just say thank you again for this paper, and it's always a pleasure to work with Diplo, and I look forward to future engagement with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Einar. Same wise from our side. What you said, I think this is critical to give you some sort of arguments when you approach governments and the why it matters, because these days people are getting a bit cynical and asking this good question: what is the bottom line and why I should be there? For example, I think that we can provide arguments for somebody from Barbados or from Bahamas, because they want to open their big in metaverse things. And metaverse will come, I would say, very soon to the question of standardization, because this is now more pie in the sky. But when it become a reality, there will be question of interoperability between different platforms and standardization. Sorina, could we hear from you this concluding remark and reflection on overall discussion, and how do you see the next steps, and what would be your message?
Not really concluding remarks. I think we started a discussion, and it would be good to continue it. And we do have an opportunity. There is a follow-up webinar to this on 15 March, we kindly invite everyone to join. We haven't set an agenda for that, so we'll be using inspiration from these discussions as to how to frame those debates. And Einar has just given a few very good suggestions. Let's see if we can get the Jamaican telecom operator to that event to tell us a bit about why they participate in ITUT and maybe somewhere else. A kind encouragement again to everyone to look a bit more carefully into the standardization issues, which are not only technical, but also are not as, I'm going to use a not fun word, crazy as they appear. Try to look a bit beyond, as I've said a few times, where a proposal is coming for and more at the content of that proposal, and assess it with a clear mind to the extent possible. And just a quick note on the discussion that was happening earlier about why should we engage in standardization and what would be the benefit. We've tried to give some examples in the paper on specific standards and the various implications they have, and building on that, how specific stakeholders could benefit from it. So look for the small boxes in the paper, and hopefully that's going to be useful. And thank you for joining us, and hope to see you also on 15th of March.
Thank you. Thank you, Sorina. Thank you, Einar. Thank you, participants. We have already very interesting agenda for 15th of March, including the results of the standardization discussion, global standardization discussion in Geneva, question of few issues that were mentioned today, including standards for disaster recovery, standard for the maybe virtual participation, many issues, not a boring time in many respects, some unfortunate, but stay tuned, try to consult the study and join us on the 15th of March. Have a nice, whatever, morning or rest of the day if you are joining from Europe. Thank you. All the best.